The sun over prosperity. Texas was not a nurturing star. It was a hammer, a relentless anvil beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth. The year was 1878, and the town's name was a piece of bitter irony chewed on by the 50-odd souls who called it home. Prosperity was a place you ended up, not a place you sought. It was a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains that stretched in every direction. A sea of brown grass and red dust under a sky that was often too bright, too empty. The wind was the town's only constant companion. It whispered through the eaves of the general store, rattled the loose pane in the sheriff's office window, and carried the grit that settled into the lines on every face, into the folds of every calico dress, and into the very soul of the place. Life here was pared down to its essentials: survival, suspicion, and Sunday sermons that spoke of a heaven that felt impossibly distant and green. Strangers were not welcomed. They were dissected by 100 narrowed, calculating eyes, their stories guessed at and their worth weighed before they'd even tied their horse to the hitching post. Prejudice was not an outspoken creed. It was the air they breathed, a quiet certainty that anyone different was likely dangerous. At the heart of this parched world, yet apart from it, was John Whitley. His ranch, sprawling over thousands of acres of the best grazing land for 50 miles, was a kingdom built of sweat, blood, and a shrewd mind. He was a wealthy man, a fact the townsfolk respected with a grudging deference. But wealth could not fill the silence that echoed through the grand, 2-story ranch house he'd built for a woman who was now nothing but a memory and a portrait over the cold fireplace. John Whitley was a widower. The word felt too simple, too clean for the gaping wound he carried. His wife, Lillian, had been the town's ideal of womanhood. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a spring sky. She was delicate, gentle, a creature of soft laughter and even softer hands. Ill-suited for the harshness of the West, she was a flower he had transplanted into the desert, and he had watched her wilt. The fever that took her 3 years prior had been swift and merciless. But John knew, in the deepest hollow of his heart, that it was the relentless sun and the crushing loneliness that had truly broken her spirit. His grief had since curdled into a quiet obsession. He was haunted not just by her absence, but by the memory of her beauty. It had become a symbol of everything he had gained and then lost, a testament to his failure to protect the one fragile, perfect thing in his life. The silence of the ranch house was a constant accusation. The empty room screamed of his solitude. He was 42 years old, a man in his prime, with calloused hands that could tame a wild stallion but could not hold on to a wisp of a woman. And so, he had done something desperate, something the town whispered about with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had contacted a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis. His letter had been short, devoid of the poetry and promises found in the catalogs. It contained only a bank draft for a sum that could have purchased a prime bull and a small herd of cattle, and a single, stark instruction. He did not ask for a good cook, a pious Christian, or a woman of strong childbearing hips. His request consisted of 4 words: she must be beautiful. He was not seeking a partner. He was not looking for a companion to share the burdens and small joys of his life. He was trying to fill an empty frame. He wanted to see beauty at his dinner table again, to hear the rustle of a skirt in the hallway, to possess a lovely object that would soften the hard edges of his world and, perhaps, quiet the ghost of Lillian. He was paying for a replacement, a living portrait to hang in the desolate gallery of his home. The day the train was due, a palpable current ran through prosperity. It was as if the town were holding its breath. By mid-afternoon, the platform in front of the small, dusty depot was crowded. It was not a welcoming party. It was an audience, hungry for a spectacle. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress and the town's primary weaver of gossip, stood with her arms crossed, her lips a thin line of disapproval. Sheriff Miller leaned against a post, feigning indifference but missing nothing. Farmers in their dusty overalls and their wives in faded bonnets stood in silent clusters, their face grim and expectant. They were there to see the creature John Whitley had bought, to pass judgment on this woman who would sell herself for a rich man's gold. They expected a painted doll, perhaps, or a frightened girl with shame in her eyes. The distant wail of the train's whistle sent a ripple through the crowd. All eyes turned east, to the shimmering heat haze where the iron tracks met the horizon. The sound grew, a low rumble that vibrated up through the soles of their worn boots. The locomotive appeared, a black beast breathing smoke and steam, growing larger and louder until it dominated the landscape. It slowed with a great, shuddering hiss, the shriek of metal on metal, a jarring cry in the afternoon stillness. The train cars groaned to a halt, dust billowing up from the wheels. A conductor in a blue uniform swung down from a passenger car and placed a wooden step onto the dirt. The door opened. The crowd leaned forward as one, a collective craning of necks. The woman who appeared in the doorway paused for a moment, silhouetted against the dim interior of the car. Then she stepped into the blinding Texas sun. A wave of silence, profound and absolute, washed over the platform. No one breathed. This was not the timid sparrow or the gaudy peacock they had envisioned. She was tall, her spine as straight and unyielding as a rifle barrel. Her dress was of a simple, dark blue cotton, practical and well-made, but devoid of the fashionable frills and lace they might have expected. It was the woman herself who commanded attention. Her hair was not golden, but the color of midnight ink, pulled back severely from her face in a heavy knot at the nape of her neck, accentuating the strong line of her jaw and the high, proud cheekbones that spoke of something other than Irish or English stock. But it was her eyes that held them captive. They were large and dark, the color of rich earth after a rain, and they were not downcast. They swept over the crowd, not with fear or humility, but with a cool, assessing fire. It was the gaze of a woman who had seen the world and had not been broken by it. There was a story in those eyes, a long, hard story, and it was not a tale for children. She was beautiful, yes, but it was not the fragile, decorative beauty of a hothouse flower. It was the fierce, stunning beauty of a hawk, a storm cloud, a flash of lightning in a summer sky. Her name, though they did not know it yet, was Ellen. John Whitley stood apart from the crowd, his hat in his hands. A cold knot of dismay tightened in his stomach. He felt a fool. He had stared at Lillian's portrait for 3 years, memorizing the gentle curve of her cheek, the placid sweetness of her smile. He had imagined a woman cast in that same mold, a creature of light and air. The woman before him was forged from earth and fire. She moved with a contained, deliberate grace, descending the step without assistance. Her luggage, a single, sturdy-looking trunk, was set down beside her by the conductor. She did not look at it. Her gaze found John, singling him out as if by instinct. For a long moment, their eyes met across the dusty space separating them. He saw no plea in her expression, no gentle inquiry. He saw a challenge. He was the one to break the gaze. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence, and took a step forward. He was acutely aware of every eye and prosperity on his back. He had made a bargain. A deal was a deal. There was no turning back now, not in front of them all. His pride, a stubborn and powerful thing, would not allow it. "Miss," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "Elena," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with a faint, unplaceable accent that made the single word sound exotic and musical. "Elena Rojas." The name, with its Spanish lilt, sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd. Rojas, it confirmed their suspicions. She was not one of them. She was an outsider in every sense of the word. "John Whitley," he said, extending a hand out of stiff, formal habit. She looked at his hand for a moment before placing her own in it. Her grip was firm, her skin cool despite the heat. It was not the soft, yielding hand of a lady. "I know," she said simply. The transaction was complete. The air was thick with unspoken questions and harsh judgments. John felt a flush of anger, at himself for his folly, at the townsfolk for their gawking, and at this woman for not being what he wanted her to be. He gestured stiffly toward his buckboard wagon, which was tied up a short distance away. "My wagon is over here. I'll have the man take care of your trunk." Elena gave a single, decisive nod. She turned and walked toward the wagon, her back straight, her head held high. She did not glance back at the whispering crowd. She did not look at the town that was to be her new home. Her gaze was fixed forward, toward the endless, dusty plains that stretched out from the edge of town. As John followed her, he could feel the weight of their stares. He heard a snippet of conversation. Mrs. Gable's sharp voice cutting through the hum. "Paid good money for that? Looks like she's seen more trouble than a cornered coyote." He clenched his jaw and helped Elena onto the wagon seat. She settled herself not with a delicate flutter, but with an economy of motion, arranging her skirts with a practical flick of her wrists. She sat beside him, a silent, statuesque presence, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for an enemy. As he untied the reins and clicked his tongue to the horses, the whispers from the platform followed them like a swarm of biting flies. They were whispers of suspicion, of scorn, of a dark and foreign beauty that did not belong in their plain, hard-won world. He had paid for beauty, a quiet thing to fill a void. But as the buckboard rattled away from the depot, kicking up a cloud of red dust that momentarily obscured the watching town, John Whitley had the sinking, terrifying feeling that he had not purchased a portrait. He had purchased a reckoning. The ride to the Whitley ranch was a journey through a silent, sun-scorched purgatory. The buckboard's wheels churned up a constant plume of fine red dust that coated their clothes, their faces, and the backs of their throats. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down from a mercilessly white sky. The landscape offered no relief. It was an endless, rolling panorama of dried grass, thorny mesquite, and skeletal-looking yucca plants that reached toward the sky like the hands of buried men. John, stewing in a potent brew of regret and public pride, felt the silence between them stretch until it was as taut as a wire. He was a man accustomed to command, of his land, his cattle, his own destiny. Yet the woman beside him was an unreadable territory, a closed book written in a language he didn't understand. The quiet chattering of his late wife, Lillian, had been like background music to his life, a soft melody that filled the empty spaces. Elena's silence was a vacuum that amplified the clatter of the horses' hooves and the ceaseless groan of the wagon wheels. It forced him inward, into the echoing halls of his own foolishness. He had to say something. To continue on in this oppressive quiet felt like an admission of defeat. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed immediately by the vastness. "That creek bed over yonder," he began, pointing with his whip. "It's dry now, but it runs strong in the spring, marks the southern edge of my property." Elena's dark eyes followed his gesture. She took in the cracked, arid gully, the heat-withered trees that lined its banks, and the hazy distance beyond. Her gaze was not that of a proprietor's new wife admiring her domain. It was the sharp, sweeping look of a scout assessing terrain for ambush points and water sources. "I see," she said. The two words were perfectly level, offering no purchase for conversation. He tried again, a growing frustration tightening his grip on the reins. "Been a dry year, hard on the cattle. If we don't get rain before the first frost, it'll be a long winter." "The land is hard," she replied, her eyes still scanning the horizon. She seemed to be cataloging every rock formation, every dip and rise in the earth, committing it all to a formidable memory. She was preparing for a battle, not settling into a home. John fell silent, defeated. What had he expected? That she would marvel at the scale of his holdings? That she would offer gentle sympathies about the lack of rain? He had asked for beauty, and in his shallow grief, He had assumed that beauty came packaged with a soft voice, a deferential demeanor, and a spirit as pliable as warm wax. The woman beside him was beautiful, undeniably so. But she was like the land itself, vast, harsh, and utterly indifferent to his expectations. She was not a melody. She was a profound and unsettling silence. When the ranch finally came into view, it rose from the plains like an oasis. The main house was a grand two-story structure of sturdy timber and stone, a testament to John's wealth and ambition. A long, shaded veranda wrapped around the front, and nearby stood a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a series of corrals. It was an empire of sweat and solitude. As they pulled into the main yard, the sounds of the ranch, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of men, died down. Figures emerged from the barn and the bunkhouse, wiping sweat from their brows with the backs of their hands. They were his men, a dozen or so tough, weather-beaten ranch hands who had worked for him for years. Their faces, uniformly curious and deeply skeptical, turned as one to stare at the woman on the wagon seat. John pulled the horses to a halt. "We're here," before he could even move to climb down. Elena was already on her feet, swinging herself to the ground with an agile grace that surprised him. She landed lightly, her boots sinking into the dust, and smoothed her dark blue dress. Silas, his grizzled foreman, ambled over, removing his sweat-stained hat and turning it over in his hands. His old eyes, shrewd and knowing, took in Elena from head to toe. "Boss," he said, his voice a low rumble. He nodded at Elena, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than welcome. "Silas, this is Miss Rojas," John said, the name still feeling foreign on his tongue. Elena met the foreman's gaze without flinching. She offered no smile, no demure greeting. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of respect between equals. John moved to the back of the wagon where her heavy trunk sat. "Jed, give me a hand with this," he called out to one of the younger hands. "I have it," Elena's voice cut in, sharp and clear. Both men turned to look at her. She stood beside the wagon, her sleeves already pushed up to her elbows, revealing strong, sun-dusted forearms. Before John could protest that it was no work for a lady, she had grabbed one leather handle, bent her knees, and heaved one end of the trunk off the buckboard. It landed in the dust with a solid thud. She then moved to the other side and, with a grunt of exertion, dragged the entire heavy chest clear of the wagon. The yard was utterly silent save for the buzzing of flies. The ranch hands stared, their mouths slightly agape. They were used to women who needed help stepping down from a wagon, let alone women who could haul their own trunks. Elena stood for a moment, breathing a little heavily, and wiped a trickle of sweat from her temple with the back of her hand. She looked at John, a question in her eyes. "Where does it go?" Shaken from his stupor, John pointed numbly toward the house. "Inside, the main room." Without another word, she gripped the handles and began dragging the trunk across the dusty yard, leaving 2 long furrows in her wake. John, feeling his authority and his masculinity strangely undermined, was left standing uselessly by the wagon. He heard Jed mutter to another hand, "Well, she ain't no porcelain doll." The reply was a low whisper, laced with the ingrained prejudice of the frontier. "She's got the look of that Spanish blood. They're a hard lot. Eyes on her could cut a man." The first night descended on the Whitley ranch, not with a gentle peace, but with a heavy, watchful stillness. The dinner table was set for 2, laden with the kind of hearty fare a man of John's standing expected: roast beef, potatoes, beans, and fresh bread baked by Maria, his Mexican cook and housekeeper. The dining room was the finest room in the house, with a long, polished oak table, heavy velvet curtains, and the ever-present portrait of Lillian hanging over the stone fireplace. Her painted eyes, serene and blue, seemed to gaze down upon the scene with a ghostly disapproval. Elena had changed from her traveling clothes into a simple brown skirt and a white blouse. Her dark hair was combed and neatly pinned. She was clean and presentable, but she had made no effort to be decorative. She sat opposite him, her back ramrod straight, and ate with a focused efficiency, as if fueling her body for a long march. The silence was a palpable entity. A third guest at the table. John tried to fill it, his voice sounding hollow in the cavernous room. "Maria is a fine cook," he offered. Elena nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "It is good." "The house, it was built 5 years ago. Lillian, my late wife, she designed the interior." Elena's eyes flickered for a brief second to the portrait over the fireplace, then returned to her plate. She said nothing. Her silence was not shy or submissive. It was a wall, and John had no idea how to breach it. He felt a familiar anger rising in him, anger at his own loneliness, at the ghost of his perfect wife, and at this confounding, stone-faced woman who refused to play the part he had paid for. He had brought her here to be a beautiful, comforting presence, and instead, she was a beautiful, disquieting void. She finished her meal, placing her knife and fork neatly together on the empty plate. She took a sip of water, her movements measured and deliberate. Then she looked up, her dark eyes pinning him in place from across the polished expanse of the table. The directness of her gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Mr. Whitley," she said, her voice low but carrying the clear, ringing tone of a bell. "We have ridden for hours and eaten a meal in silence. I think it is time we understood one another." John was so taken aback by her directness that he could only stare. She continued, her hands resting calmly on the table. "You paid a great deal of money for me. The agency was very clear about your requirement." A flicker of something, scorn, perhaps, or weariness, passed through her eyes. "I am here. Now I ask you, what is it you expect me to do here, besides be looked at?" The question struck him like a physical blow. It was brutally, shockingly direct. It stripped away all pretense, all the polite fictions he had constructed around his grief. She had seen right through him, to the shallow, selfish core of his request. He had wanted a living ornament, a pretty distraction, and she was calling him on it. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Asterisk. "I expect you to be quiet and beautiful and not remind me that you are a real person with a mind of your own. I expect you to help me forget my first wife by being a pale imitation of her." Seeing his speechlessness, she pressed on, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, as if she were speaking to a slow-witted child. "Am I to be the mistress of this house? To manage your cook and your accounts? Am I to work in the garden? Or am I simply to sit on that veranda in a clean dress until you decide you have a use for me in your bed?" The bluntness of her last question sent a hot flush of shame up his neck. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He had not thought that far. He had not thought of her as a person at all. He had only thought of the image she would present. In that moment, his disappointment in her began to curdle and transform into something else, a grudging, unnerving respect. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the faint, silvery trace of a scar near her temple, partially hidden by her hair. He saw the calluses on her hands, the hands that had effortlessly lifted that heavy trunk. He saw the profound, ancient weariness in her eyes, a shadow that his money could never touch. This was not a porcelain doll. This was a survivor. She had a history, a will, and a strength that probably dwarfed his own. He had thought to buy a docile lamb and had instead been delivered a wolf. He finally found his voice, though it was little more than a croak. I have not decided." It was a weak, pathetic answer, and they both knew it. Elena held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if his answer was exactly what she had expected. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the silent room. "Good night, Mr. Whitley," she said, and walked out, leaving him alone with the remains of their dinner. The oppressive silence and the placid, accusing stare of the portrait on the wall. Later that night, unable to sleep, John walked out onto the veranda. The moon was a sliver, and the sky was a vast blanket of black velvet punched through with 1,000,000 diamond-sharp stars. The air was cool and clean. He saw her at the far end of the porch, sitting on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was staring up at the cosmos, so still she might have been carved from the night itself. He stayed in the shadows, watching. He thought she was merely contemplating the immensity of the Texas night sky. But then, in a brief flash of starlight, he saw the glint of moisture on her cheek. A single tear traced a path down her face, falling from her jaw to the back of her hand. She wiped it away instantly. A swift, angry motion, as if furious at the momentary lapse in her formidable control. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath, squared her shoulders, and continued her silent vigil. A lone, resilient figure facing the vast, indifferent darkness. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of relentless, grinding work, dictated by the unforgiving Texan sun and the ever-present threat of the coming winter. The drought held the land in a chokehold. The creek bed John had pointed out was now a ribbon of sun-baked, cracked mud. The grass in the pastures was brown and brittle, offering little nourishment. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like the rungs of a ladder, their eyes dull with thirst. A dry, hacking cough began to spread among the herd. Lung fever, Silas called it, and each dawn seemed to reveal a new carcass for the buzzards. The ranch became a battlefield, and the enemy was the land itself. Every day was a struggle to keep the remaining herd alive. Men rode out for miles in search of forgotten springs or patches of greener grass, returning dusty and discouraged. Water had to be hauled by the barrelful from the deep main well to fill the troughs, a back-breaking, cyclical task that never ended. In this crucible of hardship, John watched the woman he had bought and saw her transform. Or rather, he saw her reveal who she had been all along. Elena was not a house ornament. She was a force of labor. She rose with the sun, long before he did, and he would see her from his window, already helping Maria haul water, her movements strong and sure. She did not shy away from the dirt, the sweat, or the smell of sickness. He saw her wade into a muddy corral to help a calf that had gotten stuck, her skirts hitched up, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't cry out or complain. She simply put her shoulder into the task, working alongside Jed until the frightened animal was free. She learned the faces of the sick cattle, and he would often find her in the sick pen, patiently coaxing a weak calf to drink, speaking to it in a low, soothing Spanish that sounded more like a prayer than a command. The ranch hands, who had initially watched her with a mixture of leering curiosity and outright suspicion, began to change. The whispers about the Mexican woman died down, replaced by a grudging respect. They saw that her hands were as capable as any man's. They watched her mend a torn harness with neat, efficient stitches. They saw her face remain impassive and calm when a sick steer in its death throes kicked out and nearly struck her. Respect on the frontier was not given. It was earned in sweat and grit, and Elena was paying her dues in full. One afternoon, Jed, the youngest hand, saw her carrying 2 heavy buckets of water from the well. He jogged over and took them from her, saying, "Allow me, ma'am." She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes, and then gave a simple, direct nod. "Thank you, Jed." It was a small moment, but it was a shift in the foundation of their world. She was no longer just the boss's property. She was becoming a part of the ranch. John watched it all from a distance, a spectator in his own life. He had expected to possess a beautiful, fragile object. Instead, he was living with a woman as tough and resilient as the thorny mesquite that clung to life in the parched soil. He found himself thinking less and less of Lillian's helpless grace and more of Elena's practical strength. One evening, the weather broke. The oppressive heat gave way to a thick, humid stillness. The sky to the west turned a bruised, violent purple. The air grew heavy, electric with a tension that mirrored the one inside the quiet ranch house. The first rumble of thunder was a low growl that shook the window panes. John sat in his study, a ledger open before him, the numbers blurring into meaninglessness. He was listening to the rising wind, a mournful howl that promised a violent release. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a second, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to split the sky. The rain came then, not as a gentle relief, but as a furious, driving assault, hammering against the roof and turning the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. He glanced out the window and saw that the wind had torn loose the latch on one of the small barn doors where they kept the sickest calves. The door was slamming violently back and forth in the gale, a danger to the weak animals huddled inside. "Damnation," he muttered, pushing his chair back to go and secure it. But as he stood, a movement in the yard caught his eye. A figure, wrapped in a heavy oilskin cloak, was already battling her way through the downpour toward the barn. It was Elena. He stood, frozen, by the window. He watched her fight against the storm. The wind tore at her cloak, threatening to rip it from her grasp. She leaned into the gale, her head bowed, each step a visible struggle in the sucking mud. When she reached the barn, she had to fight the wind for control of the heavy wooden door, which was bucking like a wild horse. For a moment, it seemed the storm would win, that the door would be torn from its hinges. But she set her feet, put her entire body into it, and slowly, inch by painful inch, forced it shut. Just as she was fumbling with the heavy wooden bar to latch it, another bolt of lightning lit the sky. In that stark, blue-white flash, he saw her face, framed by the dark, plastered strands of her hair. It was not a face of fear. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated will. She was not a woman enduring a storm. She was a woman at war with it. She finally secured the bar and stood for a second, her shoulders heaving, before turning and beginning the slow, arduous journey back to the house. John stepped back from the window before she could see him, his heart hammering in his chest. Lillian would have been hiding under the covers, her hands over her ears, terrified of the thunder. This woman had walked into the heart of the storm to protect his animals. The thought left him breathless. In the days that followed, something in him shifted irrevocably. His disappointment was long gone, replaced by a reluctant admiration that was now blossoming into a dangerous, magnetic pull. He started to watch her, not as a warden watching a prisoner, but as a man watching a woman. He noticed the way the sun caught the stray strands of dark hair at her temples, the quiet intelligence in her eyes when she listened to Silas talk about rotating the pastures, the rare, fleeting curve of her lips that was almost a smile when one of the ranch dogs laid its head in her lap. But the attraction terrified him. To love Lillian had been to care for a delicate bird. It had been a responsibility, and her death had been his failure. The wound was still raw, a deep-seated fear of loss that kept him guarded and distant. This feeling for Elena was different. It was not a desire to protect. It was a desire to get close to a fire, even knowing he might be burned. And so, he held himself back. He kept his conversations with her brief and practical, focused on the running of the ranch. He avoided her gaze, because when he looked into her eyes, he felt a pull so strong it threatened to sweep away all his carefully constructed defenses. One afternoon, seeking a spare blanket as the nights grew colder, Elena opened a door at the end of the upstairs hallway she had never entered. She found herself stepping into a room that was sealed in time. It was Lillian's bedroom. Everything was just as she had left it. A fine layer of dust covered every surface, but underneath, it was a shrine. A pale blue dress was laid out on the bed, as if waiting to be worn. On the vanity table, a silver-backed brush still held a few strands of fine, golden hair. A book of poetry lay open on the nightstand, a dried flower marking a page. The air was thick with the faint, cloying scent of lavender and loss. It was the room of a ghost, a testament to a grief so profound it had refused to let go. Another woman might have felt a stab of jealousy, of resentment at this perfectly preserved memory of her predecessor. But Elena stood in the doorway and felt only a deep, profound wave of sorrow for the man who lived in this house. A man so haunted he had turned a room into a tomb. She did not turn and leave. Instead, she walked to the window and threw it open, letting the clean, dry air of the plains sweep through the stale atmosphere. Then, methodically, she began to work. She did not throw anything away. She handled each item with a quiet, solemn respect. She took the dresses from the wardrobe, the scent of lavender clinging to them, and gently shook the dust from their folds before laying them in a large wooden trunk. She gathered the trinkets from the vanity, the hairbrush, the small porcelain music box, the delicate lace handkerchiefs, and wrapped each one carefully in tissue paper she found in a drawer, placing them beside the clothes. She closed the book of poetry and put it in with the rest. She was not erasing Lillian. She was giving her a proper burial. She was treating the past not as something to be lived in, but as a collection of cherished memories to be stored with care. When she was finished, the trunks were full and neatly latched. The room was just a room, empty, clean, and filled with sunlight. The ghost was gone. Before she left, she took a small piece of paper and a pencil from a drawer in the desk. In her neat, clear script, she wrote a single sentence. She folded it and left it on the polished surface of the now empty vanity table. That evening, John went upstairs, looking for her. He had a question about the inventory of winter feed. He saw the open door at the end of the hall and stopped dead. He hadn't been in that room in 3 years. He stepped inside cautiously. The change was so absolute it was like stepping into a different house. The oppressive, grief-soaked atmosphere was gone. The air was fresh. The room was clean, serene, and empty. His eyes fell to the closed trunks against the wall, and then to the single, folded piece of paper on the vanity. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. He unfolded it. The note said, "This is the past, but you still have the present." He read the words once, then twice. He sank down onto the edge of the now bare bed. The note clutched in his hand. This simple, quiet act was more intimate than any touch, more profound than any conversation they had ever had. She had walked into the most haunted corner of his heart, a place he kept locked away from the world, and she had not run from the ghost she found there. She had faced it with a grace and strength that left him utterly undone. She had cleaned his wound. A storm of emotion, more violent than the thunderstorm days before, broke inside him. Gratitude, astonishment, and a powerful, terrifying wave of feeling for the stranger he had brought into his home. He sat there for a long time as the sun went down, the empty room growing dark around him. A widower no longer trapped in his past, but terrified of his present. The oppressive heat of summer finally broke, surrendering to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn. The days grew shorter, the shadows longer, and the relentless Texas sun softened into a benevolent warmth. The wind, which had for months carried only dust and despair, now brought the cool, clean scent of distant rain and drying leaves. Inside the ranch house, a quiet truce had settled between its two solitary occupants. The invisible wall of transaction and expectation, while not gone, had become porous, weathered by shared hardship and unspoken acts of understanding. They took their evening meals in the dining room, but the oppressive formality was gone. The long oak table no longer felt like a battlefield. It was just a table. One evening, a chill in the air prompted John to build a small fire in the hearth. The flames crackled and danced, casting a warm, living light that joined the steady, golden glow of the oil lamp on the table between them. Outside, the world was a vast, silent darkness. But inside this small circle of light, an intimacy was taking shape, fragile and tentative. They had been speaking of the ranch, of the need to cull the weakest cattle before the first snow, of the price of feed in San Antonio. It was the easy, practical language they had developed, a safe ground of work and survival. But as a comfortable silence fell, John found himself looking at Elena's face in the flickering light. He saw not just the hawk-like beauty that had first unsettled him, but the fine lines of weariness around her eyes, the resolute set of her mouth, and the deep, quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her very bones. He no longer saw the mail-order bride he had purchased. He saw a woman, a complex and compelling mystery he felt a desperate need to understand. His note, the one she had left in Lillian's room, was tucked away in his ledger. He had read it 100 times. "This is the past, but you still have the present." She had given him permission to move forward, and he realized, with a jolt, that he could not step into the present without knowing her past. "Elena," he began, his voice softer than he intended, a little rough around the edges. She looked up from her plate, her dark eyes calm and questioning in the lamplight. He hesitated, feeling as though he were about to cross a dangerous, unmapped border. "You have never spoken of where you came from, of your people." A stillness came over her, the kind of stillness a wild animal exhibits when it senses a change in the wind. Her hands, which had been resting on the table, folded into her lap. She looked down for a long moment, studying the grain of the wood as if it held an answer. John's heart sank. He had overstepped. He had broken the unspoken peace. But when she looked up again, her gaze was steady. The wall was still there, but a small gate had been unlocked. "There is not much to tell," she said, her voice low and even, stripped of all emotion. "It is not a happy story." "I'm not looking for a happy story," he replied quietly. "I am looking for yours." She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace, as if the story were written there. "I was born in a valley south of here, close to the border. My family did not have a grand ranch like this. We had a small plot of land that gave more dust than corn, and a few goats. My father, he was a good man, a proud man. He believed in the law, even when the law did not believe in men with his name, with his skin." She paused, taking a slow breath. "There was a powerful man in our county, an Anglo who believed the entire valley belonged to him by divine right. He wanted our land. One of his prize horses went missing. They found it tied up a mile from our home. They said my father stole it. He swore he did not. I believe him." Her voice was flat, a recitation of fact. But his word was not enough. They held a trial. It was short. They hanged him as an example to the others. John felt a cold sickness clench in his gut. He could picture the scene with horrifying clarity, the rough justice of the frontier, where a man's worth was measured by the color of his skin and the size of his property. Elena continued, her gaze unwavering from the fire. "My mother, she was not made of the same stone as my father. He was an oak, she was a willow. The grief, it broke her. It hollowed her out until there was nothing left but a cough. A fever took what was left of her before the first snow fell that year." "My God, Elena," he breathed. She did not seem to hear him. She was lost in the telling, her voice a monotone that kept the pain at bay. "I was 14. The man who wanted our land now had it. He was my guardian. The law said. He took me into his home. His wife was a frail, bitter woman. They had no children." She paused, and for the first time, a flicker of the old fire returned to her eyes, hard and sharp. "He had plans for me, not as a daughter. He told me I would have a new life, serving a gentleman in New Orleans. I understood what kind of service he meant." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the unspoken horror of her words. John's hands clenched into fists under the table. "I did not wait to be sold," she said, her chin lifting slightly. "I left in the middle of the night. I took a loaf of bread, my mother's rosary, and the knife my father used to skin rabbits. I have been moving ever since, from town to town, state to state. I worked as a laundress, a seamstress, a cook in a mining camp. I learned to be quiet. I learned to look like I was not worth the trouble of a second glance. And I learned to survive. The story hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. It explained everything about her fierce independence, her watchfulness, her refusal to be helpless. She was not a woman who had been cared for. She was a woman who had fought for every breath she had ever taken. A silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of the fire. John's mind reeled. He had been so wrapped in his own grief, his own comparatively genteel loss, that he had never imagined a suffering so raw, so relentless. His wife had wilted in this land. This woman had been forged in its cruelest fires. He finally found his voice. "Why?" he asked, the word rough with emotion. "After all that, why this? Why become a mail-order bride? Why put yourself in the hands of a stranger?" She finally turned her gaze from the fire and looked directly at him. Her dark eyes were pools of ancient knowledge, reflecting the flickering lamplight. "Because I was tired of running," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of self-pity. "Every dollar I earned went to food and a roof for the night. There was never enough to build a wall, to find a place where I did not have to look over my shoulder. The agency. It was not a romance. It was a business transaction. You were offering a fortress. You were offering a place to stop." She held his gaze, her honesty as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. "I wasn't choosing love, Mr. Whitley. I was choosing to survive." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. All the anger, all the resentment he had felt toward her for not being the woman he wanted, dissolved into a profound and humbling shame. He had seen their arrangement as a simple purchase to soothe his own vanity. She had seen it as her last, best chance for sanctuary in a world that had offered her none. Without thinking, driven by an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. A tremor went through her, a violent, electric jolt, as if his touch were a brand. Her eyes widened, and she flinched, her muscles tensing to pull away. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, the instinctive reaction of a creature long accustomed to warding off unwanted advances. But he didn't let go. He simply kept his hand there, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. His hand was large, calloused from years of work, while hers was slender but just as strong, marked by its own history of labor and survival. He held on, not with possession, but with a silent, desperate plea for her to trust him. She did not pull her hand away. After a long, heart-stopping moment, the tension in her arm eased. She looked down at his hand covering hers, then back up at his face. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. The air between them grew charged, thick with all the things they had never said. The circle of lamplight seemed to shrink, pulling them closer, isolating them from the rest of the world. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat. He could feel the trembling of her hand under his. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps they both did. He leaned forward, his gaze locked with hers. He saw her lips part slightly. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to turn away, to break the spell. She didn't. She stayed, her eyes wide and dark and full of a terrible, beautiful vulnerability. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, not a claiming. It was soft, hesitant, a question. It tasted of wood smoke and whiskey and a loneliness so profound it ached. He felt her tremble, a shudder that ran through her entire body. Then she responded, a slight, tentative pressure, an acceptance. The kiss deepened, becoming something more, a recognition, a commingling of two solitary souls. It was slow, and it was real, and it broke something open inside of him that he thought had died with Lillian. When he finally pulled back, the space between them was humming. He looked at her face. 2 tears had escaped her tightly controlled composure, tracing silver paths down her cheeks in the firelight. She let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh. "I am not the beauty you hoped for," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Her gaze was fierce, unwavering. "I am not her." She glanced at the empty space above the fireplace where Lillian's portrait used to hang. "But I will not run." It was the most profound vow he had ever heard. She was not offering him a replacement for his past. She was offering him a future, with all her scars and all her strength. A wave of emotion so powerful it staggered him washed over John. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She was stiff at first, unused to being held. Then she seemed to collapse against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. He buried his face in her dark, clean-smelling hair and held her as if he were holding onto life itself. They stood there for a long time, locked together in the flickering light of the fire and the oil lamp. It was not the bright, confident light of a new day, but something far more precious. A small, fragile flame they had kindled together, a stubborn hope burning against the vast and lonely darkness of the West. The fragile hope kindled in the warm light of the ranch house fire was a secret the rest of the world was not willing to keep. In a town like Prosperity, a secret was a currency, and a scandal was a feast. The story of John Whitley and his mail-order bride, already a source of intense speculation, now twisted into something ugly and venomous. The whispers that had followed them from the train platform coiled like snakes in the shadows of the general store and hissed over the bar in the dusty saloon. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, was the primary author of this new narrative. Holding court by the mail slots, she would lower her voice to a conspiratorial rasp, ensuring everyone could hear. He paid for beauty, they say, but what he got was a half-breed with a past. Look at her eyes. No decent woman has eyes like that. The story spread, embellished with each telling. She wasn't just of Spanish blood. She was likely a cantina girl from some border town den of iniquity. She wasn't just a mail-order bride. She was property, a creature bought and paid for, with no more standing than one of Whitley's prize heifers. The town's judgment was a palpable force. When Elena rode into Prosperity with John for supplies, conversations would cease as she passed. Women would pull their children a little closer, their face masks of pious disapproval. Men would watch her with a new, insolent look in their eyes, a leering assessment that stripped her of dignity and made her the object of their crude speculation. John saw it all, and a cold, protective fury began to smolder within him. He saw the way Elena's spine would straighten, the way her chin would lift a fraction higher in the face of their silent scorn. She never spoke of it, never complained, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the guarded watchfulness in her eyes that had begun to soften but was now returning, sharper than ever. He had sought to build a fortress for her, and instead, he had brought her into a siege. The ugliness came to a head on a raw, windswept afternoon. A group of 4 men, their courage and cruelty fortified by an afternoon of whiskey at the saloon, decided to take their curiosity to its source. They were led by Caleb Thorne, a small-time rancher whose own land was failing and whose heart was soured by a deep, festering jealousy of John Whitley's success. They rode out to the Whitley ranch, their laughter loud and coarse on the wind, reeking of cheap liquor and ill intent. Elena was in the small patch of earth beside the house, where, against all odds, she had managed to nurture a small garden of hardy herbs. She was on her knees, her hands in the soil, when the sound of their horses made her look up. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands, her body poised and alert. Thorne swung down from his horse, swaggering toward her, a greasy smile on his face. His companions remained mounted, their expressions a mixture of drunken amusement and menace. "Well, well," Thorne drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a deliberately insulting way. "Look what we have here, the queen of the Whitley Empire, playing in the dirt." Elena said nothing. She stood her ground, her face impassive, her dark eyes as cold and still as a deep well. "We just rode out to be neighborly," Thorne continued, taking another step closer. "Wanted to welcome you to prosperity proper. Must be lonely out here for a woman like you, a man like Whitley. He's old news. Bet he don't know how to treat a fiery little thing like you." One of the other men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "How much did he pay for you, señorita? Was it a good price?" Elena's expression did not change, but a dangerous light kindled in the depths of her eyes. "You are on private land," she said, her voice low and steady, each word perfectly enunciated. "You should leave." Thorne chuckled, emboldened by her lack of fear. "Oh, we'll leave. But first, give us a smile. A bought woman ought to smile for a man when he asks. It's part of the deal, ain't it?" He reached out, as if to touch her face. In a motion so swift it was a blur, Elena's hand darted to a small leather sheath at her belt, a sheath that was usually hidden by the folds of her skirt. The blade that emerged was not large, but it was wickedly sharp, its honed edge glinting in the pale afternoon light. It was the knife her father had used to skin rabbits, the same knife she had carried across a dozen state lines. She did not lunge or scream. She simply held it, the point steady, aimed directly at Thorne's throat. The man froze, his hand hovering in midair. His drunken smile vanished, replaced by a look of shocked disbelief. The laughter from the other men died in their throats. "Touch me," Elena whispered, her voice a deadly hiss, "and you will learn the last lesson of your life." Her eyes were no longer human. They were the blazing, feral eyes of a cornered wolf, promising nothing but swift and bloody retribution. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was a predator. "What in the hell is going on here?" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense standoff with the authority of a whip crack. John Whitley stood on the veranda, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He hadn't been aiming it, hadn't needed to. His presence alone was a weapon. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes as cold and hard as river stone. He walked down the steps, his boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the wooden planks, and came to stand beside Elena. He did not look at her, but she could feel the heat and fury radiating from him. His eyes were fixed on Caleb Thorne. "Thorne," John said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are on my land. You are addressing my future wife. You have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride out of my sight. If I see you, or any of your pathetic friends, on my property again, I will not send for the sheriff. I will consider it trespassing, and I will treat you like the vermin you are." Thorne, his face pale, stumbled backward, away from the knife and from the glacial rage in John's eyes. He had come looking for sport, but he had found something far more perilous. He scrambled onto his horse, avoiding the eyes of his now sober companions. Without another word, the 4 men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their drunken bravado dissolving into a cloud of panicked dust. John stood and watched until they were small specks on the horizon. The wind whistled around the corners of the house, the only sound in the sudden, deafening quiet. He turned to Elena. She was still standing in the same spot, the knife held tightly in her hand, which was now trembling almost uncontrollably. He gently took the knife from her, his fingers closing over hers for a moment. He slid it back into its sheath. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with the dregs of his anger. She gave a single jerky nod, not trusting herself to speak. He looked at her, at the fierce, unbroken line of her jaw, at the lingering fire in her eyes, and at the tremor she could not conceal. He saw the survivor who had faced down 4 drunken men, and the woman who was shaking in the aftermath. In that moment, the last of his reservations, the last ghostly shadow of his past, was burned away. He had made a bargain for beauty, but he had been given something infinitely more valuable, a woman of unbreakable courage. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not bear to lose her. He knew their private understanding was no longer enough. The town needed to see. They needed to understand. "We will be married," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of war against the town and its petty cruelties. "This Saturday, in the church, I will send for the Reverend Miller. I want the whole town to be there." Elena looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw no pity there, only a fierce, resolute loyalty that mirrored her own. She saw a partner. She saw her fortress. And for the second time in her life, she chose to survive. But this time, it felt like something more. She nodded. The news of the impending wedding sent a fresh shockwave through Prosperity. John Whitley made the arrangements himself, his face a grim mask that dared anyone to make a comment. He invited everyone. A command more than a request. They would come, of course. The chance to witness the final act of John Whitley's folly was a spectacle no one would miss. On the morning of the wedding, Maria helped Elena prepare. The old housekeeper, who had come to love Elena with a fierce, quiet devotion, had laid out a simple white dress borrowed from the preacher's wife. Elena looked at it, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Not that one." She went to the heavy trunk that sat at the foot of her bed, the trunk she had dragged across the yard on her first day. She opened the lid, the scent of cedar and thyme rising to meet her. From the very bottom, wrapped in linen. She pulled out a dress. It was made of black velvet, worn soft as a memory. The sleeves were long and fitted, and the simple, high neckline was adorned with faded, intricate embroidery of crimson flowers and green leaves, the stitches small and perfect. It was old, and it was not fashionable, but it was a garment of profound dignity. "It was my mother's," Elena said, her voice quiet. "She was embroidering it for her own sister's wedding the year before she died." Maria looked at her, her old eyes shining with understanding. To wear white would be to play the town's game, to pretend to be the pure, untouched bride they demanded. To wear this black dress was to honor her past, her blood, her mother. It was to walk into that church as herself, Elena Rojas, a woman with a history, unashamed and unbroken. The church was filled to bursting. Every pew was packed with the grim, judgmental faces of Prosperity. They waited, hungry for the spectacle. When Elena appeared at the door, a collective gasp went through the congregation. The sight of the bride in a black dress was so scandalous, so utterly defiant, that it struck them dumb. She walked down the aisle alone, her head held high. She did not look at the stunned faces on either side of her. Her eyes were fixed on the man who waited for her at the altar. John watched her come, and for the first time, he did not see the hawk or the wolf. He saw a queen. He saw the crimson flowers embroidered over her heart and understood it was a badge of honor, a symbol of a lineage and a love that had survived even death. The ceremony was short, the Reverend Miller's voice trembling slightly as he rushed through the words. The air in the church was thick with disapproval. When the time came for the vows, John's voice was a low, steady rumble that filled the silent church. A promise not to God or the congregation, but to the woman before him. Elena's reply was softer, but just as firm. A pledge made from a core of tempered steel. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend squeaked, quickly stepping back. The town leaned forward, a collective holding of breath. This was the moment of possession, the sealing of the sordid bargain. John looked down at Elena. Then, to the astonishment of every person in that church, he did not lean in to kiss her lips. Instead, he took her right hand. He turned it over, his thumb brushing against the calluses on her palm. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, a gesture of such profound and courtly respect, of such tender fealty, that it shattered their every expectation. It was not the kiss of a man claiming his property. It was the kiss of a man honoring his equal. He straightened up and looked out at the sea of shocked faces, his hand still holding hers, a silent, unshakable challenge. The wedding was over. The bargain was sealed, but everyone in that church knew, with a sudden, unsettling certainty that the terms had irrevocably changed. Their public union bought them a fragile peace, a short, golden autumn where the town's judgment was forced into a sullen silence. On the ranch, a new kind of quiet settled, one born not of tension, but of a slow-growing companionship. They worked side by side, a partnership forged in the shared language of hardship and survival. They learned the rhythms of each other's presence, the steady sound of her footsteps in the morning kitchen, the way he would pause and watch the horizon at dusk. The vast, lonely spaces of the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. A shared cup of coffee by the fire in the evening became a ritual. The silence between them no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, Elena felt the constant, gnawing need to look over her shoulder begin to ease. She had found her fortress. But the West was a land that did not suffer happiness to go unchallenged. That year, winter did not arrive. It descended. It came from the north not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a judgment. A brutal, scouring force that seemed intent on wiping the slate of the world clean. The sky turned the color of dull iron and stayed that way for weeks. The wind was a living thing, a predator that howled around the corners of the house, its teeth sharp with ice. The world was bleached of all color, reduced to the stark, unforgiving monochromes of white snow and black, skeletal trees. It was, Silas grimly announced, the worst winter in 20 years, a killer winter that tested the limits of beast and man. The ranch became a frozen hell. The brief, fragile peace of autumn was shattered by a desperate, daily war against the cold. The wind drove the snow into massive drifts that buried fences and made the landscape a treacherous, alien terrain. Water troughs froze solid within an hour of being filled, requiring the men to spend their days hauling buckets from the well and breaking ice with axes until their hands were raw and numb. The true toll was measured in the lives of the cattle. The herd, already weakened by the summer drought, began to perish. Each morning brought a grim search for dark, frozen shapes half buried in the snow, their legs stiffly pointing at the merciless sky. The hay, meant to last until spring, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The specter of ruin, which had haunted them during the drought, had returned in a colder, more implacable form. The men grew gaunt and grim, their faces chapped raw by the wind, their eyes reflecting the bleakness of the landscape. John was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of desperate energy, his face a mask of grim determination. He led the men, working harder than any of them, his great strength a bulwark against the despair that threatened to overwhelm them. He was in his element, a king fighting for his kingdom, and Elena watched him with a growing sense of awe, seeing the true measure of the man she had married. The accident happened during the height of the worst blizzard of the season. A whiteout had descended, a furious, churning vortex of snow that reduced visibility to a few feet. A frantic shout from the stables revealed that one of the mares, spooked by the storm, had kicked through her stall and gotten trapped in a deep snowdrift that had piled up against the barn. John, along with Silas and Jed, plunged into the blinding storm to save her. Elena watched from the kitchen window, her hands clenched, her heart a cold knot of dread. She could barely make out their shapes, dark figures wrestling against a sea of white. They worked for nearly an hour, digging with shovels, their movements frantic against the ticking clock of the cold. They finally managed to clear a path, as John grabbed the mare's bridle to lead her to safety. The terrified animal lunged. Rearing up, John slipped on a hidden patch of ice. At the same time, the mare's flailing hooves struck a pile of heavy, frozen logs stacked against the barn wall. The pile gave way. There was a sickening crack, a sound that was both wood and bone, followed by a sharp cry of pain from John that was swallowed by the wind. It took them 20 minutes to get to him, to pull the heavy logs off his leg, and to fashion a makeshift sled to drag him back to the house. His face was ashen, beaded with sweat despite the freezing cold. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. the bone clearly shattered. The moment they brought him inside, laying him on the long kitchen table, the axis of their world shifted. The commanding presence that had held the ranch together was broken. The men stood, lost and helpless, looking from their injured leader to the raging storm outside. It was Elena who stepped into the void. The shock and fear that had gripped her crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She became the eye of the storm. "Silas," she said, her voice cutting through the panicked silence, clear and steady. "Ride for the doctor in Harmony as soon as the storm breaks, not a moment before. Jed, help me get him upstairs. The rest of you, see to the horses, then get back to keeping the herd fed. The work doesn't stop." The men, desperate for direction, obeyed without question. They saw in her the same unyielding authority they had always seen in John. For the next 3 days, the blizzard raged, cutting the ranch off from the rest of the world. Elena's life became a grueling cycle of responsibility. By day, she was the ranch boss. She bundled herself against the cold and went out with the men, directing the work, her face set against the biting wind. She inventoried the remaining feed, making the hard decisions about which of the weaker cattle would have to be sacrificed to save the stronger ones. She did it with a brutal, clear-eyed practicality that earned her the men's silent, profound respect. She was not the boss's wife. She was the boss. By night, she was a nurse. John's leg, hastily set and splinted, was a source of agonizing pain. But worse, the wound where the bone had broken the skin had become infected. By the second night, he was consumed by a raging fever. He descended into delirium, his powerful body thrashing against the sheets, his voice a low, tormented murmur. Elena and Maria took turns sitting by his bedside, bathing his forehead with cool water, trying to force sips of broth and whiskey between his cracked lips. He was lost to them, trapped in a fever dream, wrestling with ghosts from his past. He spoke of cattle drives, of stampedes, of the summer drought, and he spoke of Lillian. Elena sat in the dim, lamp-lit room, listening to him murmur her predecessor's name, and a familiar, cold loneliness washed over her. She was his partner in survival, his commander in the field, but in the deepest, most wounded parts of his mind, it was still Lillian he reached for. She accepted it as fact, another hardship to be endured, and focused on the task at hand, keeping him alive. On the third night, the storm reached its zenith, the wind screaming like a banshee. The fever, too, reached its peak. John's teeth chattered uncontrollably, his body shivering in violent, racking spasms, even under a mountain of wool blankets. His skin was on fire, yet he was freezing. "He is losing the fight," Maria whispered, her face a mask of fear, her hands clutching her rosary. "His body grows cold." A primal, desperate instinct rose in Elena, an instinct born from a life of fighting for every scrap of warmth and life. She looked at John's shivering form, at the life that was threatening to gut her out like a candle in the wind, and she knew that blankets and broth were not enough. "Go," she told Maria, her voice gentle but firm. "Get some sleep. I will watch over him." When the old woman was gone, Elena bolted the bedroom door. She moved to the bed and began to strip off the heavy outer layers of her own clothing, until she was down to her simple chemise. The air in the room was frigid, and she shivered, but her movements were deliberate. She pulled back the blankets from John's trembling body and lay down beside him, her back to him. Then, she took a deep breath, turned, and wrapped her arms and legs around him, pulling his large, fever-racked body tight against her own, drawing the heavy blankets over them both. His skin was shockingly hot, but the shivers that shook him were bone-deep. She pressed herself against him, her cheek to his back, trying to force the life, the warmth, from her body into his. She held him, a human shield against the cold that was trying to claim him from the inside out. He continued to mutter, his words slurred and nonsensical. He cried out for water, for the sun. He murmured Lillian's name again, a soft, sighing sound. Elena closed her eyes, a single tear of her own tracing a path down her temple. She held him for what felt like an eternity. The storm raging outside, the fever raging within. Her own body grew chilled, but she did not let go. Sometime deep in the night, as he thrashed in a particularly violent spasm of shivering, he turned in her arms, his face now buried in the curve of her neck. He was lost, adrift in the burning sea of his delirium, searching for an anchor. His lips moved against her skin, and he whispered a name, a plea, a single word that was not a memory, but a desperate, present need. Elena, asterisk. The word was a broken, desperate sound, but it was her name, not Lillian's, hers. He was not reaching into his past for a ghost. He was clinging to her, his anchor in the storm. Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She thought she must have imagined it. But he said it again, a little louder this time, a raw, pleading sound. Elena, asterisk. A wave of emotion so powerful it felt like the breaking of a dam washed over her. The iron wall she had kept around her heart, the wall that had protected her through years of hardship and loneliness, finally shattered. The tears came then. Not the single, disciplined tears she had shed on the porch, but a flood of hot, silent tears that soaked the pillow beside his head. They were not tears of sorrow or of fear, but of a devastating, world-altering relief. In his darkest, most broken moment, it was her name he had called. She was not the substitute. She was the sanctuary. She held him tighter, her tears still flowing, and whispered back to him, her voice thick and trembling. "I am here, John, I am here. I will not run." She held him all through the night as the storm outside finally exhausted itself, the wind dying down to a low, mournful sigh. As the first pale gray light of dawn crept through the window, John's shivering at last began to subside. The fire of the fever was still there, but the deadly chill had been beaten back, exhausted beyond measure. Elena finally drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, her arms still wrapped around the man she had pulled back from the brink. She did not know how long she slept. She awoke to a profound silence. The storm was over. The house was still. She was still in the bed, the heavy blankets over her. And John was beside her, his breathing slow and even. She sat up, her limbs stiff and cold, and touched his forehead. The fire was gone. The fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully. She watched him for a long moment, then quietly slipped out of the bed, dressed, and sat in the chair by his bedside to continue her vigil. He woke hours later, as the afternoon sun was casting long, blue shadows across the snow-covered world outside. His eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly. They were weak, but they were clear. They roamed the room for a moment, then found her. Their eyes met and held. The room was utterly silent. There was no need for words. In his gaze, she saw everything: the memory of the fever, the knowledge that he had been at the precipice of death, and the dawning, humbling realization that she had saved him. And in her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own vulnerability, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty that was more powerful than any storm. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought or memory, that he had called her name. The bargain was long since broken. The alliance was forged. But in that silent, sunlit room, in the aftermath of the storm, something new was finally, irrevocably born. The winter, having done its worst, retreated slowly and grudgingly. Its icy grip pried loose one dripping icicle at a time. Spring came late to the plains that year, not in a sudden burst of green, but in a slow, tentative awakening, the sound of melting snow. A steady trickle that swelled to a gurgle and then a roar was the first note in a quiet symphony of rebirth. The brown, frozen earth softened. breathing a damp and loamy scent that was the very perfume of hope. And for the first time in years, the vast, empty rooms of the Whitley ranch house were filled not with silence or tension, but with a quiet, living warmth. John's recovery was slow, but steady. The bond forged in the crucible of the storm had changed everything. The space between them was no longer a chasm of unspoken bargains and uncertain expectations. It was a bridge, built of shared struggle and silent understanding. He found himself seeking her out, not for any particular reason, but simply to be in her presence. They spoke more, their conversations moving from the practicalities of the ranch to the small, intimate details of a shared life. A simple touch, his hand on the small of her back as they entered a room, her fingers brushing his as she passed him a cup of coffee, became a language all its own. One evening, as they sat on the veranda watching the last streaks of violet fade from the sky, Elena placed her hand over his. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, her voice steady, "I am with child." The words struck John with a dual force, a powerful collision of pure, unadulterated joy and a cold, gut-wrenching terror. A child, a son or a daughter, a future. The idea was a sunburst in his mind, a possibility he thought had been buried forever with Lillian. A raw, powerful wave of happiness, so intense it was painful, washed over him. He gripped her hand, his throat too tight to speak. But hard on the heels of that joy came the ghost, the cold memory of his own failure. He remembered another pregnancy, another woman's delicate frame. He remembered his constant, suffocating anxiety, his terror that the harshness of this land would prove too much for her. His memories of Lillian's pregnancy were inextricably linked with the fragility that had ultimately led to her decline. The old wound, the one Elena had so carefully cleaned and bandaged, tore open anew. Fear, cold and insidious, coiled in his stomach, the fear of loss. In the weeks that followed, he became a suffocating guardian. He treated Elena not as the strong, capable partner who had run his ranch and saved his life, but as a fragile piece of porcelain, liable to shatter at the slightest touch. He forbade her from working in her garden, from lifting anything heavier than a book, from riding a horse. He hovered over her, his constant, anxious questions about her health a testament to his own rising panic. Elena bore his suffocating concern with a patient, knowing grace. She understood the source of his fear. "John," she said to him one day, her hands on his shoulders, her gaze firm and reassuring, "I am not her. I am not a hothouse flower. This body has carried me through 1,000 miles of hardship. It knows how to carry a child. You must trust it. You must trust me." He tried, but the fear was a deeply rooted thing. His love for her, a powerful, undeniable force that had grown from the ashes of his grief, was now tangled with the terrifying prospect of losing her, just as he had lost everything else he had ever cherished. The true test of that trust came on a bright, deceptively peaceful day in early summer. The land was green, the air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers, and a sense of prosperity, real this time, had finally settled over the ranch. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, an unfamiliar figure who moved with a slow, insolent swagger. He rode into the main yard and dismounted, his eyes scanning the property with a greedy, assessing gaze. He was a man in his late 30s, with shifty eyes, a cruel twist to his mouth, and a cheap suit that looked out of place in the honest dust of the ranch. Elena had just stepped out onto the veranda. When she saw him, she froze, every line of her body going rigid. It was a stillness John had only seen in her once before, the moment before she had drawn her knife on Caleb Thorne. A shadow from her past, a past she never spoke of, had found her. The man's lips curled into a smug, possessive smile. "Elena, my dear," he said, his voice slick and oily. "It took me a long time to find you. You've done well for yourself." "What do you want, Ricardo?" she asked, her voice flat and cold, devoid of any recognition or fear. "What do I want?" he chuckled, taking a step toward the veranda. "I've come to take you home, of course, back where you belong. A wife's place is with her husband." The word husband hung in the air, a vile poison. At that moment, John rode into the yard. Returning from the north pasture with Silas, he saw the stranger, saw the look on Elena's face, and a murderous rage, cold and absolute, seized him. He swung down from his horse before it had even come to a full stop, his hand already on the butt of the Colt revolver at his hip. His every instinct screamed at him to kill the man who had brought that look to his wife's face. He strode toward the porch, ready to place himself between Elena and this threat, to become her shield, her protector. But as he approached, Elena took a single, deliberate step forward, meeting the man's gaze head-on. She did not look at John, did not ask for his help. She stood, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, her spine like a rod of iron. She was not a woman in need of rescuing. She was a lioness defending her territory. Something in her stance, in her absolute and unwavering self-possession, stopped John in his tracks. He saw again the woman who had faced down a blizzard, who had run his ranch, who had pulled him back from the brink of death. His fear for her, his instinct to treat her as something fragile, was an insult to the truth of who she was. In that moment of blinding clarity, he finally understood. Trust was not about shielding her from the world. It was about believing in her strength to face it. He changed his course. Instead of stepping in front of her, he walked up the veranda steps and came to stand just behind her and to her right. He did not draw his weapon, but he rested his hand on it. A silent, deadly promise. He was not her champion. He was her second. He was the force at her back, a visible testament to his unwavering faith in her. The move was a public declaration, a shift in power that Ricardo and Elena understood instantly. This was her fight to win. Elena looked at Ricardo, her eyes filled with a cold, bottomless contempt. "You were never my husband," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "You were the son of the man who stole my father's land, a vulture who thought you could claim what was left of his life. You are nothing to me, a shadow I left in the dust a long time ago. There is nothing for you here." Ricardo's smug expression faltered, replaced by an ugly sneer. "You belong to me. We had an arrangement. I have a claim." "You have nothing," John's voice cut in, low and deadly. He had not moved. "You heard the lady. Her past is dead. This is her home now. And this is her family." He let the silence hang for a moment, his gaze as sharp and final as a hangman's noose. "If you wish to join her past, you can stay another minute. Otherwise, I suggest you ride." Ricardo looked from Elena's unyielding face to the cold promise of death in John's eyes. He saw the truth. He was not facing a frightened woman and her rich husband. He was facing a fortress, its walls impenetrable, its guardians united and absolute. There was nothing here for him to claim, nothing he could steal. He had lost before the fight had even begun. With a final, hateful glare, he spat on the ground, turned without another word, and scrambled onto his horse. He galloped away, a pathetic, retreating figure swallowed by the vastness of the plains he had hoped to conquer. He never returned. John and Elena stood together on the porch, watching until he was gone. The tension slowly drained out of the air. John turned to her, his heart a wild drum in his chest. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice rough. "I know," she said softly, turning her face to kiss his palm. "But you trusted me." "Always," he vowed. And in that moment, the last of his ghosts, the last vestiges of his fear of loss, were finally laid to rest. He was not afraid of losing her, because he knew, with every fiber of his being, that she could not be broken. Summer deepened, ripening the land. Elena's pregnancy advanced, her body changing, but her strength undiminished. A profound peace settled over the ranch. the peace of a hard-won victory and a future that was finally, tangibly real. The baby came in the deep of a rainy night in late September. The storm was a gentle one, not a raging blizzard, but a steady, life-giving rain that drummed softly on the roof, a soothing percussion to the drama unfolding within. Maria had tried to shoo John from the room, insisting it was no place for a man. He had refused, his gaze unwavering. "My place is with my wife," he had said, and that was the end of it. He stayed by her side through the long hours of her labor, a constant, steady presence. He held her hand, his strength flowing into hers. He wiped the sweat from her brow with a cool cloth. He whispered to her, words of encouragement, of love, of awe at her incredible strength. He was her anchor, just as she had been his. He was not a helpless spectator to a terrifying medical event. He was an active participant in the miracle of their child's birth, sharing the pain and the struggle, fully present in a way he had never known how to be before. Just after midnight, as the rain outside softened to a gentle patter, the baby's first cry cut through the quiet of the room. It was a strong, lusty, furious sound, the sound of a new and tenacious life. Maria cleaned the baby and wrapped it in a soft blanket, her old face wet with joyful tears. She handed the small bundle to Elena, whose exhausted face was transformed, illuminated from within by a love so fierce it was breathtaking. "A son," Elena whispered, her voice weak but full of wonder. John knelt by the bed, his heart overflowing. He looked at his wife, this incredible, unbreakable woman, and at the new life she had brought into the world. He was undone by the sheer, overwhelming beauty of it. Elena held the baby out to him. He took his son, his hands, which could break a horse and build a house, trembling as he held the tiny, fragile-seeming life. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were as dark and deep as his mother's. John looked down at the child's face, then at Elena's. He saw her entire history, her entire journey, in the fierce, protective love in her eyes. He saw her survival. He leaned down and whispered to his son, his voice thick with an emotion he had never known he was capable of feeling. "You are your mother's life," he murmured, his breath warm on the baby's cheek. "And you are what I never knew I was waiting for." 1 year passed. It was a year of gentle rains, of warm sun, of a slow, steady healing that mirrored the mending of John's broken leg. The land, as if rewarding their resilience, bloomed with a ferocity that defied the memory of drought and blizzard. The pastures, once brown and brittle, were a sea of tall, green grass that swayed in the wind. The cattle were fat and healthy, their numbers already beginning to recover. The Whitley Ranch was not just alive, it was thriving, resurrected from the ashes of a killer winter. The greatest sign of this new life was not in the fields, but on the veranda of the main house. A small boy, with his father's sturdy frame and his mother's shock of midnight dark hair, took a series of clumsy, determined steps across the wooden planks. He was 1 year old, a child of the storm, and his name was Daniel. He wobbled, his arms outstretched for balance, a look of intense concentration on his face. He stumbled, landed softly on his bottom, looked up at his mother, and let out a gurgle of delighted laughter. Elena, kneeling a few feet away, laughed with him. The sound was different now. The low, steady music of her voice, once so carefully modulated, was now frequently punctuated by this new, lighter melody. The harsh, watchful edges of her beauty had softened, not into fragility, but into a radiant, confident serenity. Motherhood, and the profound security of being loved, had burnished her. The fierce hawk had learned to nest, and in doing so, had become more magnificent than ever. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a sovereign. John watched from his chair, a half-finished cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. He watched his son, a walking, breathing miracle, and his wife, a woman whose strength continued to awe him. A year ago, he had been a man haunted by ghosts, terrified of his own heart. Now, he was a husband and a father, his life filled with a richness he had never dared to imagine. When Daniel finally made it across the expanse of the porch into his waiting arms, John lifted him high, his own laughter echoing Elena's, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that had been absent from this ranch for far too long. The change was not confined to the boundaries of the Whitley property. The town of Prosperity had changed. Too, a community forged in hardship has a long memory, and the story of that winter had become a local legend. They remembered how the Whitley ranch had been on the brink of collapse, how John had been injured, and how his foreign wife, the woman they had scorned and whispered about, had taken the reins. They had heard the stories from Jed and the other hands, how she had worked alongside them in the blizzard, how she had rationed the feed, how she had held the entire operation together through sheer force of will. Respect on the frontier was a currency more valuable than gold, and Elena had earned it in the harshest of crucibles. The tide of opinion had turned slowly. Then, all at once, the whispers ceased, replaced by nods of grudging admiration. The women who had once pulled their children away now offered her a tentative smile when she came to the general store. Mrs. Gable, the town's former arbiter of scorn, had been the most telling barometer of the change. She had appeared at the ranch a month after Daniel was born, carrying a clumsily wrapped package. It was a small, hand-knitted blanket. "Every child needs a proper Christian blanket," she had announced, her tone still sharp, but her eyes holding a new, unfamiliar respect. A hard woman. She was later heard to say at the post office, "But she's got more grit than any 10 men in this county." She earned her place. Elena had accepted their new attitude with the same quiet dignity with which she had endured their scorn. She did not seek their friendship, but she did not refuse it. She offered kindness for kindness, a gesture that slowly, surely began to mend the fabric of the community. She had become one of them, not by changing who she was, but by forcing them to change who they were. One afternoon in late summer, the familiar wail of the train whistle echoed across the plains. A year and a half after Elena's own arrival, the sound no longer held any particular significance. But an hour later, Elena was in her garden, her hands in the rich soil, when she saw a figure walking slowly up the long, dusty road that led to the ranch. It was a young woman, carrying a single, battered carpet bag. She walked with a hesitant, uncertain gait, dwarfed by the immense, indifferent sky. Elena rose, wiping her hands on her apron, a sense of profound and unsettling familiarity washing over her. She knew that walk. It was the walk of the lost, the hopeful, the terrified. The young woman stopped at the gate, her face pale and smudged with dust, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't have been more than 18. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice thin and reedy. I'm looking for the Whitley Ranch. A Mrs. Whitley." Elena's heart gave a slow, heavy beat. "I am Mrs. Whitley," she said, her voice gentle. The girl's shoulders sagged with relief. "Oh, thank God. The agency in St. Louis, they said you might be able to help me. I have an arrangement with a Mr. Abernathy, a rancher near Harmony Creek. The train only came this far. I don't know the way." Elena looked at the girl, at her worn-out dress, her frightened eyes, the desperate hope that was the only real luggage she carried, and she saw a ghost. She saw herself, standing on the train platform, alone and defiant in a world that did not want her. But there was a difference. This girl had been sent to her. This girl had been given a beacon in the darkness. She opened the gate and stepped out, closing the distance between them. She reached out and placed a firm, reassuring hand on the young woman's trembling shoulder. The girl flinched, then relaxed into the touch. Elena looked into her eyes, a deep, compassionate understanding passing between them, a recognition of a shared journey. "You will survive. Elena said, her voice soft but imbued with the unshakable weight of truth. That is the first step. She gave the girl's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a small, sad smile touching her lips. But here, she added, her gaze lifting to the sprawling, vibrant ranch behind her, to the home she had fought for and won. We also love. John sat on the veranda, his son sleeping soundly in a cradle beside him. He had watched the whole scene unfold. He saw the strange girl arrive, saw the familiar, rigid posture of fear and defiance in her stance. He watched his wife go to her, not with suspicion, but with an immediate, open-hearted grace. He could not hear their words, but he did not need to. He saw Elena place a hand on the girl's shoulder, saw the girl's terror begin to melt away under the warmth of that simple, powerful gesture. He saw Elena lead her into the house, a protector offering sanctuary, a queen welcoming a refugee into her kingdom. A wave of gratitude so immense it almost buckled him washed over him. He looked at the cradle where his son lay, the living proof of their future. He looked at the ranch, his kingdom, saved from ruin by the woman he had once seen as a beautiful but inconvenient complication. He had sent a letter with a single, shallow request. She must be beautiful. He had imagined a replacement for what he had lost. But the woman who had stepped off that train had not been a replacement. She had been a resurrection. She had not filled the empty space in his house. She had torn down the walls and built a home, one stronger and more beautiful than he could ever have conceived. She had saved his ranch. She had saved his son. And in the end, she had saved him from the prison of his own past. A few moments later, Elena emerged from the house and walked toward him, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. The sky behind her was a riot of orange and crimson, the colors of a fire and a rose. She came and sat on the step at his feet, leaning her head back against his knee, her hand finding his. They sat in a comfortable, profound silence, watching the day come to an end. The wind, which had once been a relentless, scouring enemy, was now a gentle hand, brushing through the tall grasses that had, against all odds, grown back, thick and green. It carried the scent of clover, of earth, and of the distant, coming rain. John looked down at the top of his wife's dark head, his heart full to bursting. She had been the storm. She had been the drought, and now she was the harvest. He leaned down, and she turned her face up to his. They kissed, a slow, deep, and quiet affirmation of all they had endured and all they had become. They held each other as the last of the sun's fire bled from the sky. Two survivors who had, against all reason, found more than a fortress in the harsh heart of the West. They had found a home. Their embrace was a silent testament to the resilience of the land and the stubborn, improbable nature of love. A love that could illuminate the darkest corners and make even the most desolate of places bloom. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and tell us. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of love, survival, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. Share your thoughts with us. We read every one.